thank you, Aberdeen. Special thanks to my friends Andrew and Rosemary for joining me for this presentation about the life and impact and the continuing legacy of Norbert. Also, I want to say how much I appreciated the great help of your colleague, our colleague, Ted Antry of Daylesford. Andrew and I had the pleasure of visiting, well, Andrew saw him every day. I got the pleasure of visiting a few months ago and had a wonderful time, and I miss him. So I did want to mention that. You can't see it, but in the back on the sill of my round window, there are several rocks. These are actually remnants from the crumbling chapel of St. John the Baptist, Norbert's original church in Premontre, which I appropriated the first time I was at Premontre some years ago, and didn't really think about whether either the Norbertine or French authorities might be after me for taking their patrimony, but it was very inspiring. And if you've not been to Premontre, I urge all of you to try to get there, because it's an extraordinary place, and really kind of puts you literally in Norbert's footprints, of course. I think my job tonight is to try and give you kind of the Reader's Digest version of Norbert's life. Most of you know enough about that life to appreciate that's not going to be easy. It's going to have to be quick because it was a very eventful life. I'm going to break my section on his extraordinary life into four main parts: his youth and early career development, his spiritual awakening, the road to Premontre, if you will, and then his last years as archbishop, diplomat, and counselor. They'll be necessarily quick because, as I mentioned, this is a very eventful life. Well, our man was born in or around Xanten, Germany, or maybe Gennep, which is in the Netherlands, just a few miles away, probably around 1075. We used to say 1080. More recent scholarship suggests more like 1075. And he was born into great privilege. He was born into a noble family, the Gennep family, if you will. And if you put in some context, if you know, those of you who are fans of Downton Abbey, think the Earl of Grantham. Okay, that would be, you know, the dad, Norbert. In fact, the word county as a, you know, piece of property comes from count. So think of something on that scale, but in fact, not a teeny kind of, not a teeny little county like here in the Midwest or in the East, but think of it like a Western county, these huge expanse of land. And that really is the kind of property holdings that his family held there in the very northwest edge of Germany. And so it's a life of privilege. And just a word about the context of the times, don't forget, so this is the Middle Ages, feudalism, obviously. This was a part of the Holy Roman Empire. His father was connected by blood and political influence to the emperor. And it was an apocalyptic period. Don't forget, this was just a little over 1,000 years after Christ's death. And so this sense that, you know, the world would not be long in coming to an end, this very strong apocalyptic sense was very much in the land. It was also a time of great reform in the church, a time of great religious ferment generally. In fact, this was the time of the great reformer Gregory VII, and issues were arising, great tensions over the right to invest bishops, and they were coming to a head at this period. So that's a little bit of a backdrop into the world that Norbert entered into around 1075. And he was the second of three sons. The first son, as is often the case in these situations, was going to inherit the title and the property from the father. The third son would be a soldier, and in fact, we believe went off to the Crusades when he came of age. And Norbert, not unusual for these situations, was sort of always destined for the clergy. So there he began his early lessons at the collegiate church, the canonry there in Xanten, which was and remains a major town in that area. And it's charming, by the way. If you haven't been to Xanten either, that's another place I'd highly recommend. And he moved on to Cologne for sort of more finishing training, as during what would be, we would think about his high school and college years. And at that point, he was really ready. He was formally trained and educated, and he became a subdeacon at the canonry, the collegiate church at St. Victor's there in Xanten. But he never really had a strong sense of wanting. He never really demonstrated he really wanted to be a priest. He was rather lackadaisical about that aspect of it. On the other hand, he was a very bright young man. He was very passionate. He loved life. He had great friends. He was said to have a delightful disposition. He was tall. He was handsome, and he was liked by pretty much everyone who knew him. And he liked to be in the game. And in fact, after several years as a subdeacon, he joined the court of the Archbishop of Cologne, Frederick, who was, in addition to being a major cleric, was a major prince in the Holy Roman Empire. And so Norbert sort of is in the game at this point. And even though it's a clerical position, you know, you essentially learned, you were sort of a diplomat in training in these situations. And after some years of working under Frederick, he moved into the court of Henry V, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at that point. And he loved the court by all accounts. He reveled in it. He loved the excitement, the dazzle, all the coming and goings of the officials, just the excitement, sort of being in the room, if you will. And he loved life, and he was a young man of privilege, and I think he used that privilege, and he enjoyed it. And again, to that point, had not really demonstrated much of a desire or an interest to go on with his clerical development and go on to become a priest. In 1110, however, it looks like he joined Henry V in a march to Rome, where he ended up essentially in a standoff with the Pope, Paschal II, over the investiture crisis. And in fact, ultimately, Henry essentially imprisoned Paschal for several months. And Norbert was said to be so abashed by this that he actually went to Paschal and asked his forgiveness about the whole state of affairs. We don't know whether that actually happened, but we do know that by this point, Norbert is actually starting to give serious study, serious reflection on the state of his spiritual life. Then in 1115, a few years on, he has what is the central event in the Norbert story, and I know that you all know, which is he's on the road to Vreden, he's in the woods, he's on a horse, and thunderbolt strikes, puts a big hole in the ground, throws Norbert from his horse, and he is out for something like an hour, we are told. But he comes to, he hears a voice, and the voice says, turn from evil and do good. This is a disembodied voice, as is the case in these situations. Turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it, which is, he would have recognized, as probably you do too, from the 34th Psalm. And at this point, again, we don't know whether, in fact, this literally happened this way. These sort of Pauline conversion experiences were not unheard of in early church saints' lives. But what we do know for sure is that Norbert was deep into his spiritual development and thinking. There's no question that whether it happened literally like this or something else, this definitely was a catalyzing event in Norbert's life. And he stepped back. He spent a few months in reflection with a spiritual tutor, and then he suddenly showed up at Archbishop Frederick's door one day and said, I'm ready to commit to the priesthood. And in fact, I'm so ready that I want you to ordain me as a deacon and a priest simultaneously, which you know we're aware was essentially unheard of. But this is another indication, not only of Norbert's, just his organic passion, but his rashness. All his life, essentially, Norbert wanted what he wanted. Fortunately for us, it was usually in a very good cause. And this is what he had decided he wanted. And when Frederick saw the passion, he acceded and he did ordain Norbert. And the first thing he asked him to do was to essentially reform the canonry there at Xanten, his home parish. And here we're into the second, part of Norbert's development, if you will. And canons, secular canons at this point are not secular canons, but as opposed to monastics, the canons, as you know, are the ones who, conducted the rites and rituals of the church life and trained young men for the priesthood and so forth. And the church, as part of its reform, was trying to get the canons to live a more committed, dedicated, and frankly, communal life than they typically did at places like Xanten. And they asked Norbert to come in and try and do something about that. And but Norbert, so headstrong, he came in and he essentially started telling them all what they were doing wrong. And of course, these people knew Norbert very well, and they felt like, well, who is this young whippersnapper, this hypocrite who until today, was one of the most hail fellow, well-met, people of our acquaintance. But Norbert bore in, and the tensions rose, and ultimately, within days, he literally was spat on by one of his confreres, and he retreated, humbled, and he decided he needed to figure out what to do next. I think, even if he didn't know for sure what that was going to be, I think he realized that he was probably going to be an outsider. His work in the church was going to end up being from the outside. And after several more years of deep, deep prayer and reflection, he decided to turn to an apostolic life, and he gave away much of his wealth, and he started doing a lot of preaching locally in and around the Xanten area. And this is where he sort of steps out into his public ministry. But Norbert, being Norbert, he continued to do it in a way that was pretty blunt, and he routinely was calling out clerics for clerical corruption and things that he felt like were needed to be corrected. And essentially, this continued to make him enemies. And he was eventually formally accused of being an unsanctioned preacher and also being a hypocrite, because they said, you're wearing the sackcloth, you're wearing rough wool, you look like you're an ascetic, like you're poor, but in fact you still are a very wealthy person, and so forth. And besides, you want to be a preacher, but you never got the permission from the Pope that you're supposed to have. And called on the carpet for this, Norbert actually decided, all right, then I will turn the other cheek, if you will. And he literally gave away all his money and holdings. And set out to secure approval of Gelasius, the Pope at the time, Gelasius II, to become what the Germans called a Wanderprediger, a wandering preacher. And he eventually secured that. Permission, and he started preaching, and he's wandering, and it was an incredibly Spartan existence. He and a couple associates literally foraged. They lived on roots and plants and whatever they could forage, and the kindness of strangers. And after several months of this, they staggered into Valenciennes, France for Holy Week, where several of his colleagues actually expired from exhaustion and perhaps pneumonia. And Norbert himself actually took sick and was very sick and may have nearly died. At this point, his old friend Burchard, the Bishop of Cambrai, took him under his wing. And Burchard's top lieutenant was a young man named Hugh of Foss. And Hugh was very taken with Norbert's regimen and his apostolic mission, and hooked up with him. And they decided to hit the road together, and they resumed Norbert's preaching regimen as soon as he was able. And this begins the partnership of Norbert and Hugh. Eventually, Gelasius died. Norbert felt like he needed to get permission from the next pope, who was Calixtus, and that was going to send him to Reims, France, where the pope was going to be for a conference. And there they met Bartholomew, the Bishop of Lyon, And this becomes another key point in Norbert's life. Calixtus and Bartholomew see that in Norbert you have somebody extraordinary, incredible talent, but also a bit of a loose cannon, perhaps. So they're concerned, but they also want to make sure that they're using his talents, you know, for maximum benefit. And so they talk about what maybe they can ask Norbert to do. And the first thing they want to do is ask him to take over another troubled canonry at St. Martin's Parish in Laon. Norbert very deftly sidesteps this because I think by this point he knew that this was not his cup of tea. And Bartholomew very cleverly figures out an alternative that will pivot Norbert's life. And that is, he said, well, if you won't do that, what if we ask you to establish your own order? And this, of course, took him to Premontre, which is only maybe 10, 15 miles west of Laon. And as I said, if you've not been there, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful, but even today, it's so remote that it's astonishing. And I think only seeing it in person can you really appreciate how really out of the way it is and must have really seemed 900 years ago. When he found Premontre, Norbert just felt like, this is it, I'm home. And he agreed that he would start the order with the proviso that if the people who want to come are willing to live under essentially my rules. And as I said, this was a time of great ferment. So even wealthy lords were very keen on exploring their spiritual options. And in fairly short order, they had built a substantial community. The first profession of vows, as I know you know, happened at Christmas 1121. By that time, they already had 40 clerics, but they were just getting started with explosive growth. And over the next several years, Norbert's reputation grew. Men and women, this was a double monastery situation, so men and women were welcomed, but not only clerics, people of all walks were welcomed, which was one of the reasons that it grew so fast, and it was extraordinary. How the heck they ever kept up with it, I don't know, but within several years, they were said to have thousands of people at the Premontre site. It's just extraordinary. And in the meantime, it's growing, the order is growing in other ways as well, because landed gentry who want to reform their lives are offering property and money to Norbert to build foundations, you know, elsewhere. And other bishops are prevailing on Norbert to help him with problem areas. And so a good example is in Antwerp, where his old friend, Bishop Burchard, asked Norbert to go up to Antwerp to take over what became St. Michael's, which ultimately was one of the most important foundations, you know, in the entire order. But at the time, Antwerp was very much in the grip of the heresies of the so-called heresies of a man named Tanchelm, and Norbert took some of the Norbertines up there and turned that situation around, and then made St. Michael's a Norbertine foundation. So within 4 or 5 years, they've already got upwards of a dozen foundations. Norbert goes to Rome to be recognized officially by the next pope, who was Honorius. The popes were spinning pretty fast during Norbert's life, I have to say, and it must have been exhausting to stay up with them. And at that point, it was at that point that Norbert became aware that the Archbishopric of Magdeburg in Germany, which is not too far west of modern-day Berlin, was opening, and that was important primarily because Magdeburg was the Eastern imperial city of the empire, and the king of the Holy Roman Empire at this juncture was Lothair III. And I don't have the time, and it's a little complex and convoluted, but essentially Norbert was drafted to fill the open archbishopric in Magdeburg. And when you were the Archbishop of Magdeburg, you also were a key lieutenant of the emperor. And in fact, then, and so around 1126 or in 1126, Norbert is essentially, he leaves the order more or less in the managerial hands of Hugh of Foss. And with that, he goes to Magdeburg for the final chapter of his life, which was, I told some of you that this was one of the things that I found most interesting about Norbert's life, and that was this last chapter. He was kind of like the Henry Kissinger of the of the 12th century, doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy between his emperor Lothair and the next pope, who was Innocent II, but who was challenged by an anti-pope at the time. And so the last part of Norbert's life was more or less spent reforming the Eastern clergy in, or the clergy in Eastern Germany, starting to establish the Norbertine presence in and around Magdeburg, which was so unpopular that there were literally at least 3 documented attempts on his life, which he evaded. And he ended up going to Rome with Lothair, where they, where he played a pivotal role in trying to resolve the papal situation and to get Lothair crowned as the king by the Pope, which they typically did. And so the last several years of his life were, like I said, were more or less involved in this extraordinary kind of shuttle diplomacy. But while he was in Rome, he perhaps caught malaria, which is not uncommon in those situations down there. And he died, just staggering back to Magdeburg, he died in 1134. But his order was, of course, just getting started. And with that, very quick overview, I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary, who's going to pick up the story about Norbert's broad legacy and impact in Europe, throughout all of Europe, for the next 6 or 7 centuries. Rosemary?
Thank you, Tom. That was great. That was a whirlwind tour of Norbert's life. You would have gotten an A in my class, so you're all good. But we'd hope so after you wrote a book about him. All right, I have kind of a tough audience this evening, since so many Norbertines probably know a lot more about Norbert and the order than I do, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm going to pick up from where Tom left off. I'm going to talk about the growth of the order, and then I'm also going to talk about the challenges that the order faced up until the demise of the male branch of the Norbertines in Spain in 1835, and then I'll hand it over to Father Andrew to continue from there. Most scholars would agree that Norbert never set out to found a religious order. He was focused on radical reform of the clergy with the hope that the church would return to its primitive origins espoused by the first Christian communities in Jerusalem. First slide, Mike. The order witnessed exponential growth right from the start, as we can see in this illustration, of the number of new communities founded just between 1120, the start, and 1149. So all those dots on there represent Norbertine foundations up until 1149. James Bond, in his article, The Premonstratensian Order, a preliminary survey of its growth and distribution in medieval Europe, where I got this slide from, states that the Premonstratensians, and I'm quoting, were one of the most successful of the new orders to emerge out of the ferment of religious reform which swept through Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. The order achieved a phenomenal expansion during the following 130 years, establishing a network of houses extending from Ireland to the Holy Land. By far the most important of the medieval Reformed orders of canons, they were second in number only to the near contemporary Cistercian reform. From the start, Norbert's preaching inspired a large number of people, both male and female, and Premontre, as Tom just told us, was initially established as a double monastery, as most subsequent Norbertine foundations were, with separate cloisters for males and females. Norbert incorporated the Premonstratensian sisters as the second order in 1121. And by the mid-12th century, Herman of Tournai estimated that at least 10,000 women had joined the order. Although obviously an exaggeration, Hermann's assertion gives us an idea of the phenomenal growth of the order. Speaking of the sisters, before the end of the 12th century, it had been decreed in a general chapter meeting that, and I quote, "Since the church is burdened beyond measure, we have decided by common consent that we will henceforward receive no more sisters." We now know that this decree was not followed, at least not to the letter of the law. Lay brothers also made up an important part of the order, although their numbers began to decline by the early 13th century. In 1128, 2 years after Norbert became Archbishop of Magdeburg, Hugh of Foss, with Norbert's support, was elected as the first abbot of Premontre. It was Hugh, one of Norbert's earliest and most faithful followers, who established the system of governance for the order, which continues up through today. It was Hugh who persuaded others of the need for geographical organization by means of circuries. He established the annual general chapter meeting, a system of affiliation, and the process for visitations to each house. And it was under Hugh that the first statutes were written in 1134. We can get an idea of the growth of the order simply by looking at the number of abbots in attendance at each of the early general chapter meetings. 6 houses were present at the first general chapter meeting in 1128. By the time of Hugh's death in 1164, 120 abbots were in attendance. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, there were about 30 circuries, with the largest comprising 50 houses. No one has yet established a precise number of Norbertine houses founded since the beginning of the order, or even the total number of houses occupied at any given time. However, James Bond, the author of the previously cited article, posits that more than 700 sites were settled by the Norbertines throughout their history. He adds that the total number of houses occupied at any given time probably never exceeded 500. And he also estimates that this was achieved probably around 1250, after which a slow decline set in until the end of the Middle Ages. In this next slide, we can see how widespread the order had become by the Middle Ages. Each circle represents a single circury. And as you can see, there were many communities within each circury. So I'm sorry, the letters are so small on that. Again, this is from James Bond's article, and the reprint is pretty fuzzy as well. But you can get an idea of where they were by the Middle Ages. The Norbertines were pretty much everywhere. Next slide. Although the Norbertines did not establish nearly as many abbeys in Spain as they did in France or Germany, this next slide shows you the growth of the order in Spain between 1143 and 1636, with a total of 38 Norbertine communities. At least that's what we think. It might have been as high as 40. As you can see, 27 houses, 22 male and 5 female, were founded in the 12th century. But only 6 houses, 4 male, 2 female, were established in the 13th, followed by 1 in the 14th, none in the 15th century, 1 in the 16th, and 3 new houses, the very last, in the 17th century. The growth of the order in Spain in the 12th century is indicative of growth elsewhere on the continent during that first century after Norbert settled in Premontre. Next slide. This next slide shows the order's decline in numbers after that first century of explosive growth. Another way to look at the order's growth, and I'll come back to this slide in a minute, Michael, if you don't mind. Another way to look at the order's growth is through this genealogical tree, next slide, which was produced, and it's so tiny, I tried to get it bigger and I failed miserably, which was produced in 1727. The trunk of the tree illustrates all of the houses founded directly from Premontre, while the branches show the daughter abbeys emanating from those first houses. Bond states that the first major reversal in the number of houses occurred during the Protestant Reformation. So if you can go back to that previous slide, Mike. In the first half of the 16th century. So you can see where that big drop off is. That's the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517. This reduced the total number of sites by nearly 50% and marked the complete elimination of the order from Britain, Scandinavia, Frisia, which is a large part of present-day Netherlands, and northern Germany. But the Protestant Reformation was not the first challenge faced by the order. Next slide. And then the next slide. Yep, there we are. The mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, arrived on the scene about 100 years after Norbert founded Premontre. These new orders competed with the Norbertines and other religious orders, and being the shiniest new object on the block, they attracted many young men who flocked to join them. The next slide. The 14th century brought the plague or the Black Death, and this plague decimated anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. Since the majority of Norbertine foundations were in Europe, and since so many of the houses had xenodochia or hospices, we can only surmise that the plague had a great impact on the order, although to my knowledge, no studies have been undertaken on this topic. Next slide, briefly, it's still the plague, but I think it's a beautiful stained glass window. I don't remember where I found this. Next slide. The 15th century heralded the Hussite Wars in Central Europe, which had a devastating impact on Norbertine foundations in Bohemia and Moravia, the present-day Czech Republic. Strahov and Doxany were among the many Norbertine houses that were completely destroyed. Next slide. The Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517 and was centered in Saxony, signaled the demise of Norbertine foundations in Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. During the same century, next slide, Henry VIII, with his Church of England, entailed Catholic monasteries and abbeys throughout England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Norbertines never founded any houses in Wales. The picture on the right is of Dryburgh Abbey in Scotland. Next slide. With its emphasis on the Eucharist, the Counter-Reformation presented the perfect opportunity to become reacquainted with Norbert. Norbert made the Mass the center of his spiritual life, just as it was for the first Christian communities in Jerusalem. When Norbert divested himself of his goods, he kept a Mass kit, and he celebrated Mass daily. He is known for preaching against Tonkelm's heresies in Antwerp, as Tom mentioned to us, in 1124, which also illustrates his devotion to the Eucharist. Although Norbert would never have seen a monstrance in his lifetime, he is often depicted holding one. Such images date from the time of the Counter-Reformation, when Norbert was heralded as the apostle of the Eucharist. In 1582, nearly 450 years after his death, Norbert was canonized. 45 years later, next slide, his remains were moved from the now Protestant Magdeburg and brought to Strahov Abbey in Prague via Doxany. So we have Doxany on the left, and the sisters at Doxany actually had Norbert's remains from either late November or early December. I see both dates out there of 1626, and they kept his remains until May 1st, the morning of May 1st, when the remains were brought into Prague for an 8-day celebration. If you can move to the next slide, Mike. During this, so this is from those of you who've been lucky enough to go to Strahov, this is in their museum. And this is a replica of what Norbert's remains would have been carried in, although not the original. I don't know when this was made. And then the next slide. During this 8-day celebration, there were all sorts of plays and activities going on, and Tom has the very first chapter of Tom's book is about the translation of Norbert's remains. And as part of those celebrations, medals were minted and thrown out to the crowds. And I noticed that there are a number of Norbertine associates in the audience tonight. These photos are from Frans de Boon, who's a Norbertine associate in Belgium. And he located one of these medals last year, maybe about 1.5 years ago. I almost had a heart attack when I found out, and he was kind enough to share photos with me. So, so that was part of all of the big doings in Prague as Bohemia once again proclaimed itself as Catholic. Next slide. The 17th century signaled a period of calm for the order, but it was not to last for long. Emperor Joseph II, who ruled from 1765 to 1790, known as Joseph the Sacristan because of his affinity for beautiful church buildings, wanted to end the jurisdiction of foreign heads of orders over abbeys, monasteries, and convents within his jurisdiction. So he was no fan of having Norbertines in his realm, and thus took possession of hundreds of monasteries throughout Austria, about 700 in number, not all Norbertine by any stretch of the imagination. The only 3 Norbertine monasteries to survive were Geras, Schlegel, and Wilton, which all survive to this day. Next slide. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, had tragic consequences for the order of Premontre. Next slide. Resulting in the suppression and oftentimes the complete destruction of all 92 Norbertine abbeys in France. Premontre, the mother house, was suppressed as well. The early 19th century paved the way for the secularization of abbeys in Belgium and the Rhineland. And next slide, this is my last slide. The 19th century continued to present challenges to the order. What was once a vibrant circuit, by the beginning of the 19th century, only 20 Norbertine communities remained in Spain, 18 male and 2 female. In 1835, the Spanish government under Juan Alvarez Mendizábal, pictured on the left, instituted what is known as the desamortización, or the disentailment of church lands. Over the course of 2 years, the government took possession of some 2,000 monasteries throughout the country, among them the 18 male Norbertine houses. This marked the demise of the male branch of the Norbertine order in Spain. Although many of the other exclaustrated orders, such as the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and many others, were once again able to reestablish their communities during the last third of the 19th century, the Norbertines were never able to do so. And on the right, we have the ruins of the former Norbertine Abbey of Santa Maria la Real in Aguilar de Campo. And now it's a vibrant multi-purpose center. And they've rebuilt it, and it's quite beautiful. By now, the order was in dire straits, with only a handful of houses still in existence, all of which were in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'll now turn the presentation over to Father Andrew Ciferni, who will pick up where I am leaving off.
Thank you. I remember once when I began to be the director of the Center for Norbertine Studies, saying to Dr. Bill Hyland, who was one of the originators of the center, saying that, I wasn't a medievalist. And he reminded me the order had 900 years of history. So you didn't have to be a medievalist if you could take any period if you really wanted to become an expert in it. I'm not an expert on the 19th century, but I learned in the study of church history that the 19th century is one of the most important periods in the history of the church. It's a period of great, great transition, especially after the French Revolution. So I'm picking up where Rosemary left off. So Michael, the first slide. And the way I'm doing this is through the abbot generals from Abbot Jean-Baptiste Lecuy, who was the last resident abbot of Premontre. He died in 1834, so 44 years after being expelled from Premontre. His heart is under the body of Saint Norbert in Strahov. He had his heart sent there after his death. But on April 22nd, 1834 was when he died. And in that year, he had received already a letter suggesting the possibility of the restoration of the order in Belgium. So we have a little link here of the last abbot of Premontre, the last abbot general, we might say, and the wipeout of the order in France, Belgium, Germany. And he died with very, very little hope of seeing the order restored. But we see that in this time that he died, that in many of these abbeys, especially in Belgium, there were still members who must have been vested when, if Premontre was closed in 1790, and most of those abbeys were at that point, they must have been vested at that point. They must have been young Norbertines who lasted for 44 years and were able to begin the quest for reestablishing their communities. We know, for example, that in Tangerlo, there were 24 men left, in others as few as 6. And so what they do is they begin to regather. Most of them had gone into parishes, many had died. And the reason they could regather was because of the Treaty of Luneville, which closed the period of Napoleon. In other words, that there was again freedom of religion to begin a religious life again. So we have all within the space of 2 years, re-beginning, the closing of the order in Spain, the re-beginning in Belgium, and the death of the last abbot general, all within a period of 2 years. For our personal interest as Norbertines of De Pere, Daylesford, Albuquerque, and Middleton, in that same period, 1857, the Norbertines of Bern, who always existed as a corporation, even though their abbey was destroyed in 1568, the abbot and the treasurer and the novice master lived in a refuge house, and they would accept novices from their parishes, have them trained, and go right back into the parishes. So from 1568 until February 2nd, 1857, there's no common life. But in 1857, at Heeswijk, which is not all that far from the Bern, they restart conventual life and begin that to build up. In the empire, so I'm going to come to the empire, so that at that point, around 1835 and into 1840, the only place where there is common life going on is in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and Hungary. Those abbeys are more or less thriving, but every place else in the order, there was no common life. In the empire, abbots continued to govern as figures of import in church and state. Next slide. Now, this abbot was not, he was abbot around the time of the First World War, but I wanted to give you just a taste of what life was like in the Baroque abbeys of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is Abbot Helmer of Tepla in Bohemia. He was a Knight of the Garter of the British Empire because he had the Marienbad, these baths that belonged to the abbey, and the King of England would go there every year. And Abbot Gilbert Helmer was quite used to hobnobbing with royalty, and you could see was decorated by many of the crowned heads of Europe. So it's given you a feel for what was going on in the social context of the abbeys that still did exist. So from 1790 to 1834, there was still technically an abbot general because Lequy is alive, but he's not at Premontre. What happens in 1870 is we're going to see the first abbot general after the French Revolution. But just to do as a sidebar, before we jump from 1834 to 1870, is there was life in the order, even outside the empire. There were still the sisters existed in Spain, in Holland, and Poland. So there were communities of Norbertine nuns in those countries. And there was this quite eccentric Frenchman who joined the Cistercians, the Trappists, but was told that he was too interested in splendid liturgy and that he should become a Norbertine. So he founded on his own, refounded the Norbertines of the Primitive Rigor, which had been a renewal movement in the order in France in the 17th century. That is the beginning of the Abbey of Frigolais. But at this point, Frigolais is an independently existing abbey, in some way is its own order. At the same time, the Abbey of Wilton sends to Wisconsin to Sauk Prairie, a priest from Wilton. I said sent. It's not clear to me that Wilton had a sense of a mission in the United States. What it had were a couple of priests who were interested in following German-speaking immigrants to America. That was one of the marks of the growth of the Catholic Church in the United States up until recent times, was when immigrants came from Europe, their priests came with them. That's one of the crises of immigration of Catholics for example, in the few Catholics that come from the Mideast, that the clergy don't necessarily follow them. So there was this mission of eventually 4 priests from Wilton, but they never get the support from Wilton to start a community. And also, the bishops were much more interested in having them in different parishes and not very inclined to support their common life. So that there is some activity going on between 1834 and then in 1870. In 1870 is the calling of the First Vatican Council by Pius IX, and all of the superiors general of religious orders are called to that council. And so the Vatican writes to the abbeys in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the few of the abbeys in the Brabant Circuit, Belgium, who had reunited and are now already been made abbeys again, reestablished. So there is a general chapter in Vienna, and the abbot of Strahov, next slide, is that's Frigolet. I'm sorry, I was missing my cue when I talked about the founding in France. That was the Abbey of Frigolet. I'm sorry, I missed that. So here, I thought you'd be interested. This man was abbot, I think, for at least 35 years. When he was elected, you see on the left, he looked like he was a teenager. And on the right is what he looked like was when he was elected the abbot general to go to the First Vatican Council, where he died. So the first abbot general since the French Revolution, Abbot Ziedler of Strahov, is elected abbot general, goes to Rome for the council, and dies there. Well, there must not have been too much concern about having another abbot general very quickly. Obviously, those abbeys had existed without an abbot general since 1790. But by 1883, and remember, in this period, especially these abbeys in Belgium, Grimbergen, Averbo, Tangerlo, Park, Postel, and Bern in the Netherlands, these abbeys are beginning to grow. They're becoming very well established. So that in 1883, they gather again. The abbots gather in Vienna, and they elect Sigismund Stary. Next slide. Stary, like Ziedler, is the abbot of Strahov. It is during the time of Abbot Stary that the community from Bern is established in the United States. He's elected in 1883. And in this period, I would say this is the kind of the second period of the restoration of the order in the 19th century. The first would be from 1834 to 1870. The second would be from 1883 to 1937, but I'm going to do that through these abbot generals. So what happens in this period of the abbot of Strahov, Sigismund Stary? He's the abbot general from 1883 to 1902. So Abbot Pennings is coming during this period. There are two major activities of the order in this period. Number one is, for the first time, Norbertines are engaged in missionary activity in the way that we think of that today. In other words, missionary activity by the Norbertines was the establishment of new abbeys. So, for example, an abbey like Schlegel was an abbey that went into a quite wilderness area of Austria. Once the abbey was established, that area began to get populated, and Catholics would come from other parts of Germany. But now, at the behest of the Pope, we have Norbertines from Belgium, from the abbeys of Tangerlo and Postel, going into the Congo, and from Park and Averbode going to Brazil. Those are two quite different types of missions, because the mission in the Congo is tied up with not that the Norbertines were necessarily interested in nationalism, but the Congo was the possession of the King of Belgium, Leopold. And we know today that there was quite a bit of abuse by the government of Belgium. And Norbertines were trying to work in that area, in schools and churches, in remote missions. At the same time, the Norbertines from Park and Park and Averbode going to Brazil are supporting and reinforcing the church that was already there. They opened, for example, a major seminary. So that's one thing that's going on in this period from, I would say, the second period from 1883 until 1937. The other major thing is the restoration of the order. So remember, the order is, abbeys have been destroyed, libraries have been destroyed, men have been dispersed. So they're coming back together. They need liturgical books. They're still working from the statutes of 1630. So in this period, there's a great amount of activity. And one of the things that's happening, and I think this is happening very much because of starting missionary activity, is there is a great growth in vocations. The other reason for growth in vocations, as we see in the case of Bern, is the Latin school. These were schools in Holland. Abbot Pennings was a student in one of them, where young men were learning the courses they needed, the languages they needed to go into the seminary. Those schools were great feeders for religious communities. As I say, Abbot Pennings was a product of that. So that Bern itself starts a Latin school in 1886, and 7 years later is able to send 3 men to the United States. Eventually, in a short period of time, 26 men from Bern establish St. Norbert Abbey in De Pere. But in a short time after that, they are going to go to India. So there's lots and lots of vocations coming through these schools. Of course, we're still living in a quite Catholic context, and through interest of vocations in the missions. On the home base, there is great scholarship going on about higher studies, restoration of the liturgy, restoration of Norbertine chant, and historical studies. This comes to a point of change after the First World War, because remember, up until that point, the power focus of the order is in the East, that is, in the countries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which loses the war. At the same time that the Western part of the order, Belgium and France, the refounding of Monde by Grimbergen, so that when Abbot Starry dies, next slide, we have, still in this period of focus on the East. I knew you would love this slide. The abbot who comes right after Abbot Starry dies in 1902, is the abbot of Schlegel. So you see, Strahov, Schlegel. The focus is of the leadership is in the East. But in this period, as I say, there's scholarship going on, studies to restore the order, its liturgy, its chant, its historical studies. In the decline of what makes for the decline of the East as I would say is the power center, is the rise of the Western, the Belgian, Dutch, French, and the decline, that change is seen in 1922 when this abbot dies and the abbots elect, next slide, elect Abbot Gumaris Kretz of Averbode, who pursues the work of restoration of the order in canon law, statutes, reprinting all the liturgical books. There's an interesting story about this abbot. He was elected, so remember, he's in this period of restoration, and he's elected at the age of 27, and they thought, well, we need somebody, and that's young to elect somebody, but he's not healthy. He lived until 1942. So he was an abbot for a very long time and was the abbot general from 1922 to 1937. So a man of great scholarship. Abbot Pennings starts a private boys' school in Delaware and gives the motto of that school is the motto of this abbot, Pietate et Scientia. And so he is the abbot general, the first abbot general that's coming, for you might say, from the western part of the order. He is also the last abbot general to be both abbot general and remain the abbot of his own abbey. Next slide. In 1937, when he dies, the Procurator General of the order, Hubert Notes, a priest of Tongerlo, is elected abbot general. So he has no abbey to be abbot of. Besides, he was really centered in Rome. And one of the things that he does, next slide, is makes the headquarters of the order in Rome, the generalate, at the ancient church of Santa Pudenciana. You'll see later that the order builds its own generalate because the order did not own this church or building. But he becomes the abbot general in 1937, and we are on the brink of the Second World War. This is the period of National Socialism, the Nazis, World War II, and communism, the period from 1937 to 1962. In World War II, some of the abbeys are confiscated. They weren't taken, they weren't closed, but for example, soldiers were billeted in the Abbey of Schlegel. But there is, in the Abbey of Novarichet, next slide, these 5 Norbertines were killed at Auschwitz. So there was an impact on the order within the life of the Abbey in the Second World War. This is followed, the war is over, and next slide, and now we come into the period of communism. This is the abbot on the left is Abbot Machalka from Novarichet, and the abbot in the center is Abbot Tajovsky from the Abbey of Zhelev. And this is showing them being tried by the communist governments of the Czech Republic. So now that part of the eastern part of the order, Hungary, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, is all underground. Those buildings are all taken over, made into military barracks, insane asylums, residences, pulling nuns together from many communities, and the damage done to those communities was and is horrendous, but clandestinely, some of them were still able to accept novices, have them trained and ordained, and in secret ways, the leadership of the order was in touch with that. After the war, Abbott notes tries to pull together what had been left, we might say, the loose ends before the Second World War. And in 1947, there is a very important general chapter. And for the first time since 1630, there are completely new statutes of the order. And then at this period, there is also an ordinarius. In other words, the Norbertine usages are codified. There's now all of the liturgical books have been restored, the missal, the gradual, the processional, the antiphonal. So we've come, we might say, to the end of the period of restoration. And this is topped off by the spiritual directory, the Directorium Spirituale, comprehensive work of Abbot Gisquer of Averbode. So this is, for me, the end of the period 1937 to 1962. What happens in 1962? All of this restoration and spiritual directory, etc., it's all finished by 1959, and in 1962, Pope John the 23rd announces there is going to be a council. And at this period, at the opening of the council, the order elects Norbert Kalmels. Next slide. You'll see his picture in a moment. This is his a copy of his he was a great writer, and this was his diary from his, because as Superior General, he was a member of the Second Vatican Council. You'll see his picture next. Not a very good picture, but he was elected Abbot General the same year that the Second Vatican Council opened, and he led in the opening of the General Chapter of Renewal of 1968 and 1970 that produced not new statutes, but constitutions called the Day of Pentecost. So, I mean, you have to have either with a sense of humor or sadness for some people, that all of this restoration that comes to its head in 1959, within 3 years, is opened up again for discussion. And that happens in the general chapters of 1968 and 1970. And it is from the spirituality of those two chapters that in many ways we are still living. In 1982, so I'm just going to go now through the Abbot General since then. Abbot Marcel van de Ven from the Abbey of Bern, Abbot of Bern, is elected the Abbot General from 1982 to 1996. In his time, the fall of the Berlin Wall, so the Eastern abbeys open up, and he is able, with the rest of the order, to support those abbeys in their rebuilding. He's followed by one of his classmates from Rome, Hermenegild Noyens, the abbot who had been abbot of Tongerlo. He was abbot from 1996 to 2003. And he's followed by a German abbot, Thomas Hungredinger, from 2003 to 2018. He in particular had a great sense of pursuing the spiritual renewal of the order, leading to a revision of the 1970 constitutions. And that happened, next slide, in the summer of 2018, when the Abbot of Averbode, Jos Wouters, was elected Abbot General. He was probably the most moving force behind the rewriting. No, it was not a complete rewriting. It was making the constitutions of 1968, 1970, more specifically Augustinian and Norbertine. His motto, next slide, is Spiritu ambulate, walk in the spirit. You know, Augustine, that was a very big image for Augustine, was to keep moving, to walk, to sing as you walk. And so I'm going to close with this slide and that word, that we are always called to walk in charity, to walk in love, and to continue the passion for the order, the commitment, the growth, the willingness to accept new challenges that I think we have seen since the restart of the order from the middle of the 19th century. Thank you.